Hi everyone. I have a lot of things I've been wanting to talk about, and I actually had several tabs up here for several days, but I was having some problems with my computer, so I had to shut it down last night, and I lost all my tabs, and I just pulled these back up this morning. But that's something I want to get back to. I wanted to talk about the number 727 and how I believe God seems to be confirming the year with those numbers and what I believe that number represents. But I also wanted to talk about this video over here that I was watching last night by Jonathan Kleck, and this is called Series Intro System of Control. And in this video he was explaining how there's a relationship between the ants and the aphids, what he called a symbiotic relationship, where they seem to live off of each other, but the aphids are actually unaware of their condition and their situation because they've been underground, many of them, for several generations, and so they don't really know what it's like to be out in the real world. All they know is what's underground and the system that they're under. And they don't realize that they're actually slaves to the ants. Okay, so he was explaining in this video how he asked God how he could explain the present condition, and God told him to use the analogy between the ants and the aphids to describe it. And so what I did last night is I tried to do a table with the words ants and aphids, and as you can see, this came up with 7 matches, and both the words ants and aphids are coming up in ELS form. And this was coming up in Genesis 27, and I've talked about the number 27 and how I believe that represents the year 2017. And then it's coming up in verse 11 is the first verse that comes up. And I've talked about how I believe the number 11 is a representation of DNA. And I'll get back to this scripture that came up in this first table, but then I added some more terms. I added the words earth, heaven, God, Satan, hell, and pit open. And this time the first match came up in Isaiah 44, which again is another number that represents DNA because there's 44 autosomes in the human DNA. The 23rd chromosome is a sex chromosome, and so that one's set apart. And then the 22 autosomes, one set comes from the mother and one comes from the father. They're identical, and then the 23rd chromosome is a sex chromosome, so that's not necessarily identical. So it's not an autosome. So this is a number that represents DNA, because when the DNA is restored, we're going to share 44 autosomes with Christ's DNA, but then the 23rd depends on whether the person is male or female, so that one is set apart, but the 22 should be identical. And I believe that's why there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, which match with the 22 almond cups and in the menorah. I believe that's why there's 3 sets of 22 books in the Bible, making a total of 66 books. And I believe that's also why there's 22 chapters in the book of Revelation. I believe that's all a representation of DNA. And I believe this represents the temple, this first verse right here, which I'll read in a minute. But the reason I thought this was amazing is because, like I said, this is coming up in Isaiah 44 verse 28, which is the last verse in Isaiah 44, and then Isaiah 45 verses 1 through 8. And I recognize the scriptures because there was another video that was done some time ago by Jonathan Kleck, where he was talking about the staircase that he was putting up in his container, a metal spiral staircase, and he kept hearing the phrase, I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. And in this testimony over here, he was explaining how George had explained how he was hearing the word prison over and over again, and Jonathan Kleck's mouth dropped when he heard that, because he kept hearing this phrase, which he explained how he believes this is a representation of DNA, and I believe that as well. And as you can see, it's in Isaiah 45 verses 2 through 3, and it says, I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that you may know that I, the Lord, who call you by your name, am the God of Israel. Okay, and so this is exactly where this table came up. It came up in Isaiah 45, where it says exactly that. But I'm going to start reading it from Isaiah 44:28. It says, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Thus saith Jehovah to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and will loose the loins of the kings, to open the doors before him, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee and make the rough places smooth. I will break in pieces the doors of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou may knowest that it is I, Jehovah, who call thee by thy name, even the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel my chosen, I have called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, though thou hast not known me. I am Jehovah, and there is none else besides me. There is no God. I will gird thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am Jehovah, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I am Jehovah, that doeth all these things. Distill ye heavens from above, and let the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open, that it may bring forth salvation, and let it cause righteousness to spring up together. I, Jehovah, have created it. Okay, so this is exactly where these terms came up, where Jonathan Kleck was describing how we're in a prison and how this is our present condition, but this is all related to the DNA, as he was explaining here in this video when he was talking about the spiral staircase that he was building. And so, like I said, this was coming up in Isaiah 44 through Isaiah 45, and I'll just quickly go over the terms. You can see the word open came up straight up and down, and right where you see the word open, it says, I will loose the loins of the kings. And over here you have the gates shall not be shut. And over here it says the doors of brass. I'll break in pieces the doors of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And then it's talking about the treasures of darkness, that thou may know, that thou mayest know that it is I, Jehovah, who call thee by thy name, even the God of Israel. So this is where you have the word open, and then you have the word pit over here in the green. You have the word Satan over here in the light green, and it's sharing the A in aphids. You have the word aphids in the pink going through the word open. You have the word ants over here, and then you have the word hell in the yellow. going through here as well. Okay, and like I said, I believe this is all a representation of DNA. I believe that's why it's coming up in Isaiah 44 and then going on to Isaiah 45. And I just wanted to explain earlier when I said that chromosomes are identical, I meant to say homologous, and I'll just explain this definition over here. It says the cell has two sets of each chromosome. One of the pairs is derived from the mother and the other from the father. The maternal and paternal chromosomes in a homologous pair have the same genes at the same loci, but possibly different alleles. And I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce that word, but they're not necessarily identical, but they're homologous. They match each other, and so they're attracted to each other, and that's why they join together when the 23 from the mother and the 23 from the father join together. The identical chromosomes find each other, the homologous chromosomes find each other and match up because they're homologous. Okay, and so in this table over here, it was talking about, in verse 2, it says, I will go before thee and make the rough places smooth, and I will break in pieces the doors of brass and cut in sunder the bars of iron. And so there's a distinction between the rough places and the smooth. And then when you go to the first table that was coming up in Genesis 27:11, which is another number that I believe represents DNA, because the homologous chromosomes look like the number 11. They look like two sticks. So I believe that's why it's in chapter 11 or verse 11 when it talks about the two witnesses usually, or the two sticks or two staves. I believe it's usually talking about DNA. And over here, I believe this is talking about DNA as well, because it says, and Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, behold, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. So this again is a description of the two types of DNA. This would be a representation of the goat skin, which is what the temporary tabernacle was made out of, and then the smooth skin would be a representation of the stones, the white stones that the heavenly temple is made out of, the New Jerusalem, which is a representation of the restored body. And as you can see, this is coming up in Genesis 27, which I believe represents the year 2017. Okay, and at the end of this video about the staircase and the container, they mention another scripture, which is a parallel scripture, and this is coming up in Psalm 107, verses 14 through 16, and it reads, he brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death, and he broke their chains in pieces. Oh, that men would give thanks to the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men, for he has broken the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron in two. Okay, and so this was coming up in Psalm 107, which if you leave out the 0, that would be 17. And then it's in verse 14, which I explained in my last video, that's when the separation takes place, that there seems to be a pattern throughout the scriptures with the number 14. I believe it represents the 144,000, but it also represents the veil being rent, which is a representation of the DNA being broken asunder in order to be restored. And so over here in verse 14 it says he brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and break their bands in sunder. Okay, so here are some more examples of the renting taking place in verse 14. This is Revelation 6:14, when the sky will be rent. And then this is Exodus 14, when Moses parted the Red Sea. And then this is Zechariah 14, when the Mount of Olives splits. Okay, and this is all a representation of when the veil was rent, when Jesus died on the cross. This was a type and shadow of when the veil will be rent when Jesus comes back. And this is all a representation of the DNA but I'll have to continue in the next video. Thank you.